Fool's rock shelter name came because we started on April Fool's. And Mrs. wisely insisted that we not put her name on it because that might tip people off as to where it was prematurely. What happened here was this big rock fell off the face of this cliff and lodged itself right here. And over thousands of years, material has washed over the edge of the cliff and out through here, eroding this rock shelter out, and it's piled up here because of this big rock. And then the people who lived here would leave scattered artifacts around, and it would get covered by a thin layer of material, and then another group would camp here, and it built up over thousands of years. And down here, what you're looking at in the excavation is a hearth. That was a living surface at one time. We think about 2,500 years ago, so close to that. Now you can see in the sidewall how there's laminations. Each of those laminations is a big rain event that covered up what might have been on the surface here at that time. We don't know how deep this goes or how old it's going to be. That's all the fun. We're going to find out. That bank right there with all those laminations in it is the most important part of this rock shelter because it contains biobotanical information of the environmental past.
Explain that a little bit.
There's plant remains and pollen in those sealed laminations. They're secure. We know they're secure. They're not contaminated. An analyst will be able to draw lots of information out of those pollen about the plants that were thriving at the time, which says a lot about the amount of rain, how dry it was, how wet it was, the conditions that these people were living in. The laminations have also a lot of charcoal in them, and so we'll be able to securely date those laminations. So we get a time period for that weather condition. The artifacts that are also in those levels, many of them are time diagnostic. And so we can say that this hearth right here is surrounded by artifacts that are called Frio points. So that those are the people, we know them as the Frio people because there's no written information about them. And we'll be able to say that those people lived here at this time, and these were the conditions that they lived under.
So what time period are we at now at this level?
I'd have to get the book out, but I think
Somewhere
it's
around the time of Christ.
Yeah.
Plus minus 500 years.
Everything else below this is going to be before Christ.
Okay.
And we're hoping it goes way on down and goes back to the earliest human occupations in America.
Have you found any tools to speak
yes,
of?
we've got lots of tools. Let's go look at them.
Okay.
Well, this dark point, even though we cannot directly date it, other examples typologically similar to it or exact have been found in secure archaeological deposits with material that could be radiocarbon dated. And so over a period of time and from different excavations, this point type has been dated to 8,000 years ago. And so
Does it have a value?
monetary value. Yeah, they all do. I mean, you can imagine something 8,000 years old is going to have value. You could take this to an artifact show and probably get $50 for it. Now, this is the specimen of obsidian we talked about. Very rare to find that in an excavation.
How far away did that come from, possibly?
Dr. Hester, who's pretty experienced with this stuff, thinks it came from the Yellowstone.
What?
Yeah. Well, obsidian is not found naturally in Texas. So anytime you find obsidian in an excavation in Texas, it means it came from a long ways off. And that's a long ways for a time period when there was only foot travel. It's the same thing as this flint from around here, but it's glass, so it flakes really easily. And it's a good cutting material, besides being very beautiful. So I'm sure it was prized by the peoples here in South Texas for both reasons. This specimen right here, when it came out, all of us involved in this excavation looked at each other And your mother's name came up immediately because she was telling us how wonderful things were going to come out of this shelter. And we've dug these things before, you know, and there are a lot of beat up tools, a lot of things people wouldn't recognize as artifacts. Your mother seemed to float on air when she talked about this rock shelter and the wonderful things we were going to find here. And when this came out, we all looked at each other and thought, this one, he knew a lot more than we did about what was going to happen here.
You can spot them, huh?
Yeah, well, she was just sure that the place was special, and it is very special. This is the latest artifact. Your brother actually found this and didn't know it. As he was watching us dig, he was leaning against one of the upper units and just messed around with his finger, and he exposed some bone. Well, later we looked at that bone, and it's actually a sawn piece of bone that was used for a knife handle. I don't know if you can see the striations of the saw there. And then that is a drilled hole. It was drilled with a metal drill because you can tell because it's so circular. And this is mid 1800s. So this represents, we're sure, the last people who lived in this. And this may be, it could be that it was a bone handle from some of the later Indian groups that were raiding the European settlers in this country. This was a good hideout for them. So, I don't think your brother knows that yet.
And I'm not going to tell him.
Well, I'm going to tell him. And we know how old these type of dart points are, so we can put an age on that trade into Texas. And it matches up pretty good with a culture called, a time period called Woodlands in the Midwest. What were they called? Hopewell? The Woodlands?
Yeah.
Anyways, they're known to have brought obsidian out of Wyoming, and then this kind of ties that to them. A trade network with the Frio peoples of South Texas and the Woodlands cultures of the Midwest. All right, we got right here is a early corner notch type point that we know is around 8,000 years old. This point was found down by the old cemetery at the other corner of the property, on the surface.
On the surface.
Yes. This is a Frio point, which these are what we're finding the most of right now. All right, they're about 2,000 years old, 2,500 years old. There's more samples of them. That they got the little fish-tailed look to them. And another one.
Used for what?
These are
would you say?
spear points used with the atlatl.
With these two?
All three of these. This is another type of spear point that's called a paternalis. It's the most common point type in Texas.
Now, how are you able to determine that as opposed to just being a flat rock?
Well, you got to look at a lot of chipped rock. That's how. And because this specimen here is beat up, and you just have to know what you're looking at. Have handled lots of them to be able to recognize attributes that would classify it. This is a common triangular point. It was found in the excavation at an upper level, and we thought at first it might be a very early point, but looking at the attributes, the flaking attributes of it, it's not. And a triangular artifact is a very common shape used throughout history. So we were assuming that it's associated with the Frio peoples. Now this would have been another archaic dart point. We could call it a Marshall point. And it's about the same age. Then we have...
Now, what age is that?
About the same age, 2,000 years ago,
Okay.
generally. Here we have what's called a transitional archaic point. This was made during a time when things were transitioning from the atlatl to the bow and arrow in South Texas. The points the spear points began to get smaller and smaller and smaller because, I mean, can you imagine shooting that on a little arrow? You know, it just wasn't going to work. And then finally, we have this type of point, which is called a Perdiz point, and it's a true arrow point. It'll be 1,000 years or younger, shall we say. And these were the last peoples that we know of, last prehistoric peoples that we know of that used this rock shelter, these type of points. We think there's good evidence that the Clovis people, the first whose culture we can identify, were actually from Western Europe. Yeah.
No, why are they called Clovis?
Because their dark points were first exposed in an excavation near Clovis, New Mexico. These are Clovis era artifacts. Clovis is the earliest identifiable culture in North America. These are about 12,000 years old. And Jeff found them in the Colorado River, right?
Yeah, washed out on gravel.
Near LaGrange, Texas. This was probably a finished Clovis spear point. This was a preform. It was roughed in and never finished yet. But these were probably left in a cache, buried cache on a campsite, and then washed out eventually into the river. After 12,000 years, that's a lot of erosion, you know. And the people are going to be camping fairly near the water, so this is not uncommon for this to have happened over that time period.
So Columbus wasn't the first person here in the United States?
No, I'm afraid not, but at no fault to him, or no intention to him, he introduced diseases which wiped out this country. When the next Europeans came, there weren't very many people living here, and they assumed, and we've all assumed for a long time, that there was a sparse population, but it wasn't. During the time when European contact with Native Americans, the local peoples who were living here called themselves the Tonkawa, and along the coast, the Karankawa. Those are the only names we have. Later tribes were driven through the Seminoles, and you'll see a lot of geographical areas around South Texas with Indian names, and they're generally going to be tribes that were driven through from the east by the settlers' expansion.
How'd you get interested in this?
When I bought the ranch in Frio County, we started finding arrowheads about the time that I also got on the internet. And there was just Googles of information on archaeology, including two archaeological groups, the Southern Texas Archaeological Society and the Texas Archaeological Society, who both welcomed me in and taught me lots of stuff.
How long have you been doing this?
8 years.
Now I've been working on this site up here with Clint McKenzie, who is the primary investigator. He's the archaeologist. He used to be the San Antonio city archaeologist. Okay. We're learning a lot here. It's a potential for being one of the biggest sites in Texas, and we're going to see how that works out.
So Joe, what are you recording there?
I'm measuring